great. Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, nice. Thank you very much.
Miami.
Miami. Miami is not mon ami. When I did a documentary in which I visited all the states of America, naturally, when people said, gosh, you've been, I drove in a London black cab from Maine all the way down the coast and round and up and down and up until I ended up in Washington State. Didn't take the taxi to Alaska and Hawaii, but went separately to Alaska and Hawaii. So I did go to every state. So not unnaturally, when people have said, gosh, you've been to every state of the Union, which one did you like best? And I try and answer that I never know quite what to say. I say I like South Kentana, you know, a mixture of Kentucky, Montana, South Carolina, and maybe Northern California would suit me. It's very hard to pick a favorite. But then they'd say, which one did you dislike most? And I always said Florida. I mean, it has its charms. Northern Florida, this is the peculiarity of America, Northern Florida is the South. Northern Florida is like Alabama or Georgia, which border it. But Southern Florida, where Miami is and Orlando, is, to me, it's a Gehenna, it's hell. It's just, it's rude and sort of brash and just nasty and glitzy and unpleasant, and I couldn't wait to be shot at the place. I mean, it's got a lot of hot weather and beaches, but they sort of ruin them with hideous architecture. There's the South Beach, has some nice pastel deco, but even that's become pretty grim now. I just didn't like it. I didn't like it. It just struck me as, it's full of nightclubs and pumped up people, physically sort of shiny with pumped upness. A lot of blusher.
Okay.
Yeah.
Norwich City.
On the Bowl City. Yes, well, we've gone up. We were champions of League One. I come from Norfolk, and so if you're going to support a football team, you might, if you're in West Norfolk, support the Linnets from King's Lynn, who are in terrible trouble, I'm sorry to say. But it's more likely, of course, because you want to watch professional football of a reasonably high standard, you'd support the Canaries, who are Norwich City. And so, you know, one's gone through their trials and tribulations and their sort of mediocre successes and into the age of Delia, as we call it, and the extraordinary joy and satisfaction that has brought, both because of the commitment and sheer bloody money that she has given the club, but also publicity of a kind you could never hope to get. When one famous dark night of the soul, she decided to get up and yell at the entire Barclays stand and the cameras with her famous "Let's Be Having You," which is just one of the great moments in football history. I think it's phenomenal. You know, not everybody loves football. I love a lot of sport, and football I particularly like, but I'm not saying this just because I like Norwich. I think there's some real pleasure in supporting a team like Norwich rather than having the burden of Arsenal or Chelsea or Man U or Liverpool, because you so expect them to win. So even when they win, it's somehow not quite good enough. You just sort of, yeah, but it was only 2-0. Or, yeah, but, you know, it was a double, but it wasn't a treble. You know, it's just like every time and when they lose, it's like they've been punched, and all that money and all those players, and all those Ferraris and all these, you know, wags and that whole world. It's just, whereas a local team, you know, when Norwich win, it is, wow, they won. I can't believe it. You're so happy. And if they lose, you make a joke about it. It's kind of, oh, well, obviously, you know. And you sort of don't mind. That's the point, is that the risk-reward ratio is so fabulous, as it were. You know, there's nothing to be unhappy about supporting Norwich, because it's always a kind of course it's terrible if they go down, and if they're in such terrible condition that they would lose their, you know, there'd be a share crisis or something, but you know, they're sort of reasonably prosperous for who they are, and there's just nothing but good to be got out of supporting them. But incidentally, do you know the 3 sides in Britain that are rude, that have swear words in? right? There's Arsenal,
Gunthorpe.
Scunthorpe, and Manchester United. Silly joke.
And on that sweet note, Stephen, Oscar.
Oscar. Well, you can probably tell I could talk about him forever. Thing I always say about Oscar, and if you've heard this before, forgive me, because I don't quite know how else to phrase it, but if you know New York City, if you know Manhattan, and when you go down Fifth Avenue, and I literally mean down because it's one way, and it goes down to the Village, you pass the Empire State Building, which is, was for many years the highest building in the world, and it's still jolly high. And of course, naturally, if you're a curious tourist, you will pass it and you will look up, but you won't really see it because it may be very tall, but there'll be a building nearer you that can be as short as anything, but it will blot it out by in the way that even a person can be taller than it if you're very close to that person. But if you get a good run of green lights, you go all the way down, it seems to rise like a Saturn V rocket as all the closer buildings are dwarfed and they appear to be pygmies, and it comes up in its true size. And I think as 1900 gave way to the year 2000, 100 years after the death of Oscar Wilde, he did that. Every year that passed, he got bigger and bigger and bigger, and we saw what an extraordinarily great man he was. Not just, of course, a wit, and like Falstaff, a cause of wit in others. Not just, if you like, almost a messianic figure in that he was despised and rejected of men, but as Ellman says at the end of his biography, he stands before us now, so wise, so kind, and so right. It's extraordinary how right he is about everything. And throughout the 80s and 90s, as I began to get a bit well known, I'd be asked occasionally to do a debate at a university or to give a talk at a college, and sometimes you get, you go back and there'd be a party in someone's rooms and you'd drink wine and coffee and all the rest of it. And I began to notice that whereas when I was a student, what people would have on their walls would be Che Guevara, obviously, John Lennon, Jimi Hendrix, Lenin, Marx. As the 80s gave way to the 90s, and since the death of Lennon and the rise of super commercialism in rock music, young people were no longer under the illusion that revolutionary politics or rock and roll would set the world free or make anybody happy. And you would start to see posters of Einstein and, above all, Oscar, because he symbolized the fact that it was the life of the mind and art and imagination that would set people free. And he, as a kind of Prince of Bohemia, to students in particular who are given for 3 years the keys to the kingdom of Bohemia and hope they will always keep them and never be seduced into a world of false morality and false closed convention, and never close their minds but keep them open. Oscar stands as a symbol of that more than any other man, I think. He stands for gay or straight or any other kind of age of consent she just felt should be the same. And so I was rather with her on this, and almost didn't matter what the age was as long as it was equal, it seemed to me. But I remember addressing in Westminster Hall a group of people, and I said this thing that I trot out from time to time about when do you know you're gay, and that I remember when I was born looking up and saying, well, that's the last time I'm going up one of those. And
that's such a bad gag.
It's terrible, isn't it? I'm ashamed. But the point it was...
It's also verbally wrong, of course, because you didn't go up it.
No, part of me did, yeah. But the real thing that I said, and I'm convinced is true, there were a lot of MPs saying, what gay people do, is that what's shocking about love is never the physical part of it, it's the emotional part of it. It's not... People may do all kinds of things with their bodies, which may or may not disgust or alarm one, but it's how much of themselves they subsume in another person is something quite extraordinary. And it's it's so, I mean, it's the subject of most films and most songs, and yet it's so extraordinary that we never stop to contemplate how bizarre it is that's what we give ourselves to. And that is the secret of almost every human being you meet. If you meet someone who is an utter turd, and in life you will, you only don't do that thing they tell you is, oh, imagine them all naked, and then you'll have contempt for them. That's not the point. Imagine the absolute truth of even the most aggressive, unpleasant, self-regarding, vain, unsympathetic person you could ever meet, and remember that they are not only desperate to be loved, but they are desperate to love. And I've never met a human being of whom that isn't true. And it's so astonishing that we don't even bother to think about it because it's almost too much for our brains to take in, I think. Anyway, sorry.
Folk music.
Folk music, yeah. Oh, you remember? I did the Britannia Awards, Folk Britannia or whatever, awards for the. I'm very fond of folk music, and I think, as always, like Martin Amis, who's been on this stage many times.
Are you getting a little obsessed?
What, with Martin Amis?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I was. He's a great writer. Well, yes. But resistance to the cliché is an important thing. And when I was starting out in comedy, it always annoyed me when I saw comedians doing things that other comedians did, but not only that other comedians did, that anybody in a bar could do. So that if you said folk music, they'd just go like that. And you go, that is the cheapest, it's like the equivalent of pornography in comedy. It's just like just touching a sort of comic G-spot that is unworthy. That really, the comedian I'd respect is the one who came on and said, isn't folk music great? And make it funny that it was great. Because the idea that all it is Morris dancers. Folk music is the music of roots music. You have to change the name to make people like it. But some of the most talented musicians, Kate Roosby, people like that, in Britain are folk musicians. And the music is deep and it's complex and it's exciting and it's unusual. I won't say that it's automatically better than any other kind of music, but that it is most certainly worth listening to. Yeah.
Genome. Where would one scroll you back to on your way to the Congo 2,000 years ago, 100,000 years ago?
Oh, me? Gosh. Well, I mean, John Lennon, we're all peasants as far as I can tell, I think was John Lennon's line. I'm lucky enough to have done, which I'm sure many people would love to, that BBC programme, Who Do You Think You Are, where you can at least go back to some extent in your roots. But again, the devilish part of me, although I'm very interested in the Fry family, and I was very interested in my mother's family, you know that old story about the invention of chess and how the emperor who had commissioned the best minds in the empire to come up with a game that was both fair, didn't give an advantage by luck, but also was complex. And this game inventor came up with chess, and the emperor said, this is so brilliant, I'm going to give you any reward you want. And the inventor said, well, you see this board, it's 8 squares by 8 squares. If you could put a grain of rice on the first square, and put 2 on the next square, and then 4, and then 8, I'll take all the rice that you fill the chessboard with. And the emperor thought, well, I got away with that easily, didn't I? And of course, he hadn't got halfway before it became apparent that this was more rice than there was in the world. And that is the power of exponential curves, of the arithmetical progression of numbers. And it's the same with us and parents. We have 2 parents and 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16, 32, 64, 128, 256, 512, 1,024, etc. Yeah, it soon becomes a gigantic number in a very short time, such that it is obvious we have, if you have any English blood in you at all, for example, choose England, then you must be directly descended from William II, if not from Henry III, a later one, because you have more ancestors going back then than the population of the country. So you must. There's no possibility that you aren't, even allowing for quite a lot of incest. And yet you meet someone someone who's called Bridgeworth, and they'll say, oh yes, there have been Bridgeworths in this part of Sussex for 200 years. And you say, well, 200 years, you have thousands of ancestors. And each one of them is as responsible for your existence as any other. The fact that we happen to live in a society that chooses the patronym, the one male that holds the surname, doesn't mean you're more related to them. If any one of those thousands didn't exist, you wouldn't exist. Now, this becomes important in a sort of xeno-philosophical way, in an ethical way. And in fact, going back to Cambridge, and E.M. Forster wrote a wonderful essay called On Jew Consciousness in the very early 30s, around the time of the ascension of Hitler and Nazism and the rather accepted face of anti-Semitism. He said, I'm not here in this essay, he said, I'm not going to argue about whether or not anti-Semitism is moral or immoral. I have my views on that, but let's just look at one side of it, about whether or not Jews are a stain and a bad thing. He said, let's take the best-known family in the world. He said, I would submit that is the House of Windsor. So let's look at the Prince of Wales, as he then was, the great Prince of Wales. David, became Edward VIII. I do not believe that even the Prince of Wales could name his 8 great-grandparents, let alone his 16 great-great-grandparents. And if he can't, from the most famous family in the world, then how can any of us name our 8 great-grandparents? And if one of them is Jewish, or even a part Jewish, we wouldn't exist but for Jews. It is up to those who say, let's cleanse the race of Jews, first to prove that they aren't Jewish, and they won't be able to. The fact is we are so miscegenated. And that's really the point about genomes, is, what do we base our identity on? It's really interesting. And when I was in Kenya filming in November last year, it was the American election, and it happened to be the time that obviously Obama won it. And I was filming, and there was some people from the same tribe that Obama's father came from, and they said, I said to them, God, you must be very excited that America's got a black president, and he's Kenyan. He said, yes, but remember, if he had been the same man who had stayed in Kenya and become president of Kenya, he would have been our first white president. So, and I said, oh, yeah, and it won a Smarty Award. I said, it's very, very good. I read the second one as well, and I remember going to a party at someone's house, and it was like the third day of reading a novel. Takes about, if you do it slowly and easily and without too much, hurry, and enjoying yourself and, giving yourself time to get it right. I would say 3 days, 10 to 5 with an hour for lunch and good tea break and a good coffee break. You can get it done, and in a way that is not too straining on your voice, and you can keep refreshing it and it being interesting. So it was the end of the third day, and I wasn't husky exactly, just a tiny bit like that. And someone said, what have you been doing? And I said, I've been reading this children's story. It's the second one, actually. I said the first one was called Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and this one is called Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets. And one person at the party said, oh, yes, I've heard of these. I think they're quite popular. And I said, yeah. I said, they're beginning to be. There was an article, someone said, in a paper about these new children's stories about this. Is he a wizard or something? I said, yeah. And like have parents read it to their children and then sit on the stairs reading the rest of it to themselves. And I said, yes, because they are quite Moorish, I said. They are fun. So it's slowly and then when I'd done the third one, I said, oh, the Harry Potter, oh, yes. But the really amazing thing was when I was doing the fourth one, Jo Rowling herself had done a tour of America, a signing tour. And she'd just taken off there. And by this time, these were the most famous children's stories of their time, and they were about to become, perhaps, she was the greatest literary phenomenon of our age. And she told me about, signing cues. We've talked about the photography, but there's also that people have presents for you, and they're very sweet. Anyway, she was in a shop in New York on the first one, and there was a massive line of people. And there were, like 700 boys with scars on their foreheads, and little goggle spectacles. And there was even a woman with a gilt frame around her, a fat woman, I mean, it's just, you get really bizarre things of that nature. But every now and again, someone in the queue would say, "Oh, Miss Rowling," as they would say her name wrong, usually. "Miss Rowling, I have this for you," and they would hand over a little envelope. And the person from Scholastic, her publishers in America, or from her agents, would grab the envelope and say, "Thank you," and snatch it away, and Joe would go, "Oh, thank you, yes," and sign. And this kept happening, and eventually, after hours and hours of signing, the last book was signed, and she was rubbing the callus on her finger, and she turned and she said, "By the way, you were very rude to those people who had things to give me. You just snatched them away like that. It was a bit odd, I thought. It was a bit offensive." And they said, "Oh, no, Joe. These people have written their own scenarios in which Hermione does this or Ron does that. This happens to Dumbledore, and they've written little plot lines, whatever. And so when your next book comes out, there will be some similarity and crossover, and they will attempt to sue you. But they will not be able to sue you because your fingerprints are not in the envelope. You have never seen what they have written. We can depose before witnesses that you never saw any of this. It will be signed and sealed in a safe that you have not read it. And we will save you a lot of hassle." And that's when she thought, this is not normal for children's authors, is it? This is a new territory. This is a new area for a writer to be in. It's wonderful to be successful, but when your people have to think like that, you realize it. And sure enough, of course, dozens and dozens of lawsuits came. "I gave you a story about Hermione and you used it." And she would, you know, they would get a letter back from a lawyer saying, in legalese, "Off out of my face, you mad bitch." And there you are.
Can I ask the audience for an S?
Ooh. Oh dear. Oh dear, sex. Well, it was the first thing that was called out.
It's the only thing that was
Yes, it was the
called
only thing that was called out. Not my natural area of expertise, though. I can cook a few courses in the banquet of love, I like to think, but I don't know what that means either.
God, it's going to be on record that you said that. Probably in your obituary.
I was called up in the 80s. I created a strange rod for my own back. When in the 1980s I was called up by a rather marvellous man who may have played, if that's the word, it may have appeared at Hay, called Jonathan Meades. I'm sure he has. You may remember some of his documentaries about architecture. He usually wears sunglasses and a dark suit, but he's a rather wonderful writer. But at the time, he was a features editor or similar at Tatler magazine, which was, I think in those days, being edited by, I was either Tina Brown or it might have been Mark Boxer. And he called me up. And I was not a well-known person. I'm talking about 1985 or something like that. I don't think even Blackadder would have come out yet. But I was well-known in a small circle because I was doing a little bit of journalism, a little bit of radio. I'd done some TV comedy and things like that. And some, you know, the writing, I suppose, mostly. And he said, I'm commissioning some people to write an article about something they don't do. Gavin Stamp is doing something about the fact that he doesn't drive. Brian Sewell is doing something about the fact that he doesn't go on holiday. Somebody else is doing something about they would never have a pet. Is there anything you don't do? So I thought about it. I said, gosh, I like to think I do almost everything. Well, there's sex, I suppose. I don't do that. Would that count? And there was a sort of pause. He said, 400 words by Thursday. And it so happened, it fell out that I've talked a bit about love, which is obviously the important thing, but I'd had a partner at Cambridge, and he and I had stayed together. In the first year after leaving, we shared a flat together in London. But he was much more interested in the sexual gay world of London in the early 80s, and I wasn't. I've always absolutely loathed gay bars and clubs and things, just because I can't bear being looked at in that sort of inspect you sort of way, that raking eye that goes up and down, and I just feel so inadequate. And all I want to do is have a conversation, and certainly don't want to dance, and I don't want to grind away in some dark room. I just want to, I just want to say, so which is your favourite Evelyn Waugh novel? And it there aren't any bars for people like me, unfortunately. So I sort of just gave up on the whole idea of sex, and was happy because I was. If I have a motto at the moment, anyway, it is a line of Noel Coward's that somebody told me about not long ago, which he apparently said to Ronnie Neame, the film producer and director, who was saying to him, "Gosh, you do so much, and you do the plays and the songs and the this, and you never relax, you never stop. Why is it?" And he said, "Because work is more fun than fun." And that was sort of how I felt. Work was more fun than fun. If fun was sex, I got a much more buzz and high and a much more lasting one than, in fact, they were the opposite of each other. You know, it was slightly difficult and hard to start off the business of work, and it took a long time, but in the long run you felt fantastic afterwards, and sex is quite opposite to that. And so, I just found myself not having physical congress of any kind, and that's what I was writing about. It had been about 3 years in the article, and I also said it is most peculiar that nature or the divine being, whichever you choose, should somehow insist that the objects of desire, the prize, in sex, the physical areas should be contiguous and adjacent to the areas in which the expulsion of the most noxious poison is also taken care of. It's as if nature